Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. This week we have an interview for you conducted by our very own Mona with her friend Rafael. We realized last week after our conversation on Orlando and the shootings and the LGBTQ community that, in fact, we explicitly talked about the fact that all of us were white and hetero and that it would be helpful to have other voices involved in this conversation and hear other perspectives. And that's exactly what this interview is. So I won't spend too much time here in the beginning explaining what's going to be talked about. I just encourage you to keep listening to this particular interview. If you get to the end of it and you have questions, comments, or concerns for the show, you can always find all the ways to get a hold of us at irenicast.com/feedback. And if you have anything to say to this particular episode, you can do that on the show notes at irenicast.com/69. So again, without any further ado, here's our interview this week with Rafael.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening in to another episode of Irenicast. This week, we have an interview with a friend of mine named Rafael. Hi, Rafael. How are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Rafael is a friend of mine from seminary, and I've just always enjoyed conversations with him. And I thought he would be a great person to hear from after our episode last week on Orlando. And I'll let Rafael take it away and tell you more about himself.
Well, again, it's great to be here. I've been listening to the stuff and the work that you guys have been doing, and I think it's wonderful. So I'm very flattered that you wanted to chat up with me about this. Everybody, my name is Rafael, and we've known each other now for a couple of years. I am originally from Cuba, so I'm Cuban American, although I spent a chunk of my adolescence in Puerto Rico, and my parents lived there for about over 30 years, and I called Puerto Rico home for all of that time. So I'm also half Puerto Rican in my upbringing and in my soul. And I'm a lawyer by training, but I have been practicing communications and government affairs in the corporate field. And after working for the government for a couple of years, for many years now, and took time off to go to get a master's in theological studies, and that's where we met. And I'm back in Miami now, working full time again.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show. And we talked about the fact that it's been in a lot of conversations that it was Latino night at the Pulse nightclub. And so hearing from LGBTQ people of color in this particular instance is really important. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. Another reason to have you on was just because I love everything you say.
You're so sweet. And I should also say, I didn't make it part of my introduction because it's such an assumed fact for me. But yes, I am gay, and I came out when I was 21. So that was a piece of the equation for being here.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so where do we start? What's it like being gay and Latino? How do you ask that question?
How do you ask that question? Well, like we've mentioned in previous conversations, it's difficult to speak on behalf of a whole group of people, and I'm certainly not here to speak for others. Just for myself and my own experience. And it is not an easy thing, but like in every other context, it's easier for some people and more difficult for others. It depends on your background, depends on your family, depends on your religion sometimes. So, but it's still a very difficult thing. Our Latino culture is very influenced by our religious traditions, is very influenced by what we would call in school patriarchy, or in our culture communismo. I remember growing up as a kid in Cuba and then later in Puerto Rico, and commonly hearing things like, one of the worst things that can happen to a family is that one of the kids is gay or lesbian. Back then, we weren't even talking about transgender. So I think it's definitely gotten better. It's gotten easier. But it's still very difficult for many people, even after they come out, and families have gotten better about embracing it, but it still takes a lot of work and takes a lot of time, and sometimes it's work that is completed much more successfully than other times. And certainly what's been happening recently has brought up the whole reality of what LGBT people go through, and in particular in the context now of Pride celebrations and all of this commentary on the horrible tragedy in Orlando, and specifically highlighting, as you said before, the fact that it was Latino night. I think that's also brought the Latino face within the LGBT diversity up to the forefront, which is all relatively positive in the midst of hugely negative and horrifying contexts.
Before we started recording, I asked if you wouldn't mind sharing about how coming out has affected your personal relationships and your family, especially growing up in a religious context. What was that like for you?
The first thing that came to mind was actually the story about, the first couple of years after I came out. And you'll relate to this. One of the ways in which my mom, who is a wonderful, amazing human being and whom I adore, one of the ways in which she began to cope with it was she never told me this, but I could tell she was kind of praying it away. Not out of disgust, but out of a sense of concern, and love for me. And it came to a point where I found it deeply offensive and insulting. And I even considered, taking a break from going home on vacation because it hurt so much. And I had a conversation with my dad about it. And my dad said, these are the tools that your mom has at this moment to show that she cares and to manage this situation. So just try to accept it and love her for that. And wow. I've never been able to forget that. And so I've also had those moments this week when I sit there and I go, are people just being polite? Is this like the new thing to, feel empathy and care about the LGBTQ community and all of this stuff? And then I inevitably reach the answer I'm most comfortable with, which is people know the best most anyway. Most people do the best they know how to with the tools they've got at the moment. And I think it's important to still teach people the value of our own experiences and to signal to them in ways in which they may be missing the mark. But I think it's also important to let them in, just like it's important to let our friends in and our parents in and our family in, even though it's imperfect and even though it's not perhaps the way we want it to be, or it doesn't come wrapped up in the packaging that we wished it would. It's still a step in the right direction. And I think we need to remain mindful of that.
I think that's very gracious and wise. And I really like that. And I have seen both of those messages, what we talked about on the last episode, people saying, let us be alone and bury our dead and grieve. And then on the other hand, where are you straight cis people? Why aren't you fighting for us? And I think both of those messages are valid. I don't think anyone has the right to invalidate either one or privilege one or over the other.
Mm-hmm. Can other people truly feel our pain? Can other people truly relate? Are there attempts at empathy authentic enough, or authentic, period? How do we discern all of that? And which overtures do we accept and which ones do we deny? And because I've engaged a little bit in that conversation over the last few days with some people, And actually, most of them were not even Latino, but they were saying, they were speaking from a place of righteous anger, and I could understand what they're saying. And they were saying, you know what, save it. And they were saying this to the larger straight world and saying, let us mourn and do our thing by ourselves. And I can relate to that on a personal level because I tend to be a private person and, about my deepest emotions, I guess, although I speak very freely about emotions in general. And when I'm going through difficult times, it's something I need to do. I need to find my space. I need to find my corner, my safety cocoon. And a lot of times I don't even allow really close friends into that space for a little bit. And then I actually have my good friends who will be knocking on my door and saying, hey, too long. What's going on? Let us in. And I thank them for that. But I can relate. I can relate to the need for space, and to be with your own, even if not on your own. But I also think there's danger in that.
Yeah, I resonate with the need for space too. That makes total sense to me. And certainly we would never want to be in this moment, in this time, in our context, in these conversations, be invasive. That's the last thing anyone wants is to do further damage. But it does raise a really interesting set of questions around politics in this time. There's a struggle where politics and grief are getting pitted against each other unnecessarily, it seems like. Because of the news cycle we have today, it's so fast. And if an event happens and we take a couple weeks off to be alone and bury our dead, it's very difficult to come back from that and get the political momentum to get things rolling. So It's really unfortunate that times of terror have to be utterly politicized, but it almost seems necessary in some ways. I don't know.
I don't know that it is or it isn't necessary. I think asking ourselves whether it's necessary or not is useless and irrelevant because it is. It is a fact, and I'm a big proponent of facing reality and dealing with facts. So I think it is politicized, whether we wish it weren't or not. It is, and we got to jump right in there. I took my time for a few days when people started hinting at the Scar Omar's possible issues or struggles with his sexual identity, and I was like, hold off, let's. I haven't really seen anybody come forth and actually say that they were with him or whatever. We now have seen a bit of that. I actually read something about that a day or two ago on NPR. But I was taking my time because I didn't want to go there yet. I was digesting it from the political, the gun control, the terrorist, the Islamophobia perspectives, and that was already enough on my plate. And then I found myself, really having to dive into the whole phobia and internalized phobia perspective. And to be honest with you, out of all of those heart-wrenching angles, the one that tore at me the most was that one, because I have seen it. I have seen it over and over again. I lived it. I remember when I was in college and I was barely 17, 18, and I went to a very liberal school at Brandeis University, and I was hanging out with one of my best friends, and we were at this party, and all of a sudden I saw two men dancing next to us. And I was 18 at the time, and I had to get up and leave the party because I hadn't owned up to my own truth by then, which I did by the time I was 21. And ever since then, we think, oh, the generations have changed and people now in their 20s are much freer. And, they are, but they aren't. I still see a lot of people. I see it in the streets. I see it at the gym. I see it at work. I see it at church. I see it on airplanes. I see it everywhere. men and women, but obviously mostly men who are, I can tell from the way they look at me, from the way they behave, and the family that they have trailing along with them, that there is that huge level of dissonance in their lives. And I have seen that play out in very destructive ways. And so that was an angle in the last couple of days that has really hit me close. And even yesterday, I'm now in the corporate environment, and I should say I'm here discussing this with you, representing myself exclusively. I'm not here on behalf of any organization or any corporation, and nobody's paying me anything to say anything here. But I do work for a place where, that has gotten 100% rating from Human Rights Campaign over the last 7 years for its inclusion of LGBT employees. But here in Miami, which is where the headquarters for Latin America are, it's not quite the same story. And so yesterday I had the opportunity to get in front of 100 people from our office and give a quick presentation. And I forget now what it was that I said, but I referred to my being gay in sort of the same way that I usually do most of the time. It's just very matter of factly. And I was making a joke or something. And then I got an email last night from this woman who moved here. She's from Argentina, and she's married to another woman, and she moved here recently, let's say in the last 6 months or so. And she was thanking me for bringing this joke. And when I say joke, it was like, I wasn't making a joke of being gay. I was making a joke and saying it as a gay man and making everybody laugh. And she was thanking me for it. And then she started referring to the fact that her perception was very different, and that she felt like she was back in the closet, and she was having to relive all of those emotions that she had gone through in the past. And then with everything that's happened in Orlando in the last week and a half. And, it all brought it back to me that, the largest issues are at the same time the most personal. And I've been thinking a lot about Harvey Milk and that wonderful phrase that he said, which is the most, I forget if the term he used was political or daring act of rebellion any LGBT person can do is actually come out. And I keep thinking that maybe if this disturbed man had an opportunity to do so, perhaps 49 people wouldn't have gotten killed.
So with this particular terrifying event in Orlando and the self-hatred and internalized violence that you're describing, like, what do you make of that as someone who has come out and as someone who is, as I know you, very proud to be gay and someone who embraces yourself? How do you interpret that? How do people get past that?
Well, interpreting is I think, at least for me, easier than explaining how people get past it. It's hard to answer how people can get past it. There are times when I look at somebody and they show themselves to be the kind of person who would be able to get past it rather easily because their parents and their background is relatively accepting and liberal, because their own views are very accepting and liberal, and so are their friends and their environments, and yet they don't. It's very, very difficult to second guess what is in somebody's heart or history, and what the exact nature of their fears are. But in interpreting that aspect of this tragedy, I just see I see it congruently. I think that there are many forces at work here. I think from what I've read, I'm no expert, but from what I've read, it sounds like this person was prone to certain levels of violence, was somebody who was certainly not very comfortable or happy with himself on many levels. And it showed in the way he treated other people, including the women in his life, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of forces at play, but the one force that we were speaking about, which is the internalization of hatred, it's very easy to understand. I think it's it's whenever you hate something in yourself so strongly, and you haven't yet owned that hate, it's relatively commonplace to see how that can get then misdirected at the very people who remind you of that part of you that you're not yet ready to own. I've seen this many, many, many times in friends, in mentors, and relatives, professors, priests. In fact, I've discussed it many times with them, and even within the context of our faith and people who are very religious, from the Catholic to the evangelical. There have been many times where I think, and we see it in history. Open up the paper and you see people who have spent a lifetime in a career demonizing LGBTQ people, and then all of a sudden they find out that they've been leading a double life.
Mm-hmm.
It's very common, very common. But the one other thing about it, where you were referring to, you used the word unique, and here I want to make a point that perhaps is not as popular, and when we go through these tragedies. And it's a point that I've had to learn being a Cuban American immigrant myself, but also being the son of a generation of Cuban American immigrants who hold very dearly and very tightly to their sense of loss over their own histories in the early 60s in the country. And what I'm getting to here is that what I always tell them is, we don't own the exclusive rights to pain or to suffering or to tragedy. This is affecting us right now, and it's good that we own it, and it's good that we face it, and it's good that we spell it out for what it is, and it's good that we try to address it as Americans, as LGBTQ people, as Latinos. But it's also good to remember that this stuff goes on all the time, everywhere, and we continue to live rather insulated lives, watching Apple TV, and forgetting that there are hundreds of thousands of refugees that are living in misery right as we speak, and that there are thousands of LGBTQ people who are getting thrown off of rooftops and told that they're going to be stoned to death in other countries in Africa, and being told the same thing in Russia, and being told the same thing in Guatemala or in a remote area of Mexico. And that there are other people also who are not LGBTQ who face this as well, by virtue of, and here, I'm not going to get too academic, but it's I always go back to the mimetic theory of Girard, the othering, the scapegoating of the other, that seems to be always so embedded in the way that we socialize, unfortunately. And so that's why, to me, it's important to mourn. It's important to applaud and accept who you are, but it's also important to remain open to solidarity. The one that we are called to extend to others when we are not terrorized, but also the ones that others feel compelled or at least inclined to share with us when we are terrorized. Because if we don't do that, then the terror wins.
That's powerful. That's really powerful. And I'm thinking in context of what you said a few minutes ago about owning your own hate. I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it quite like that, but that's a really interesting way to put it. And I think perhaps we can't move into any kind of solidarity or real empathy unless we face the hate that blinds us, that we've inherited, that we've adopted, even without meaning to.
Absolutely. I mean, it was, I think yesterday or the day before that, that I was reading this amazing sermon, and I think I might have shared it with a few people on Facebook, and it talked about that. It was what's her face, Nadia Bolz-Weber, and she was talking about how her first instinct is to want to demonize the other, and I think that happens to all of us. I get furious when I hear what Trump has said. I get furious when I see that we have an opportunity to do some very basic common sense things about gun control in this country, and still you have 40 something senators last night just basically saying, nope, we're not going to do it. It's right to get furious, and there's a righteous place for that anger. But I think it's also, I don't know, perhaps not everybody feels as inclined to consider this perspective, but my being Christian perhaps informs some of it for me. I am commanded to get past it. And
Wow.
I am commanded to, doesn't necessarily mean that I approve it. It doesn't necessarily mean that I applaud what Trump is. It doesn't necessarily mean that I condone voting for him, which I consider to be very dangerous at this point in time in our history. But it compels me to seek the humanity that's buried deeply in there. I forget who it is now that said the bullies are afraid too. And, that doesn't mean that we sit there and, say, oh, well, let's give them a break. It doesn't. There are causes and effects and actions and consequences. But I think if we stay in the retributive justice angle of things and don't push ourselves into more solidarity and into a place of greater spiritual what's the right term? Magnanimity? No,
magnanimity.
Magnanimity.
I don't know.
You're making me feel
I knew what you meant.
Well, if we don't force ourselves to get there, we're missing half the trip.
That's so good. That's so good. And that's a good reminder for me too, because my anger feels so overpowering sometimes, even to myself. It's so much easier to find a party to blame. It's so much easier instead of looking at how things are interconnected, how everyone's complicit, what we could all do better. I think you're right. I think it does mean resisting it, almost an animalistic instinct to find an enemy somewhere and kill them,
Yeah. Well, it's what our enemies do. It's what a whole camp of this country is doing with Muslims. And we could stop there, but that wouldn't be the complete story either. Because if you think about it, it's also what a lot of Muslims do to the LGBTQ communities within their midst. And it's a lot of what the Catholics do to the LGBTQ community in our midst. So it, again, going back to that othering and that scapegoating and that need that often goes hand in hand with the righteous anger to place others at a distance is valid, is absolutely valid. But if we stay, I just think that if we get stuck in that righteousness all the time, and trust me, I speak from experience. We really don't get to the other side. We don't get to the mountaintop if we get stuck there. It's like going again to the internalized hatred. It's understanding. I think it was also Maya Angelou who said something like, being human means that nothing human can ever be foreign to me.
Wow. Wow.
And that's pretty powerful shit.
That's I will agree with you. And you know, and as you're talking about this, I'm going back to the Bible and thinking, how many times in my life have I heard the words "love your enemies" to such a degree that I'm almost inoculated against it. But really thinking about what that means for real, loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you, and beating your swords into plowshares. What that actually means is like really hard, painstaking work. It's work that requires you to go beyond like your very basic instincts. And to, like you're saying, to push past it and to still reach out in love. And it's simple, but it's so, it goes against the grain, you know?
It's hugely transformative. And I think that's the reason, why the figure of even just historically, even if we leave theology aside, the figure of Jesus was so powerful, and has remained so influential to this day, is because it goes exactly against that grain. It goes exactly against the scapegoating. It goes, and again, I keep going back to Gerard and his mimetic theory and all of that, because I think it really is onto something. And I don't mean to give a lecture here now, but it's all about he starts from an anthropological premise that we learn to desire from observing others, and that the social context precedes us, and it is through others that we learn to desire and covet things. And then as a result of that, the way that we socially deal with conflict and pressure is by scapegoating. And so we agree to scapegoat a third or fourth, and then that scapegoated victim gets banished from the society. Order is maintained, and an understanding of what's happened also gets maintained. A preservation of the common narrative, if you will, and then he goes on theologically to say, well, Jesus was actually the one scapegoated victim who actually kind of, allegedly comes back to tell the story, and tells the story and still doesn't condemn the ones that were scapegoating him in the first place.
I've never heard that interpretation before. I've not studied Gerard, but that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's powerful, but it's incredibly difficult to do. I mean, forget it. It's just like we can spend 14 lifetimes trying to do it. It's just not easy.
But we have a model to strive toward, I suppose you could say, and we have each other, and I think it's easy to forget in such an individualistic society that we're really meant to be with each other and figuring things out together. We don't have to be alone in this.
Yeah, and it just takes me, even just beyond that one example. I mean, just look at history. We've had a lot, actually, of people. You look at the civil rights movement and look at all the people that got dragged, beaten, fire hosed, beaten up by dogs, and they never raised a fist. There's something very, very powerful in that, and I always go back to that, and especially in my world, just with words, I'm very I can be very drawn to be cruel and lash out in my words, and that's my favorite way to scapegoat and to other, and to distance myself and to put myself up in the pedestal of righteousness. And I think there are instances such as the last week where we have to distance ourselves, where we have to proclaim our truth loudly, and where we have to condemn evil also very loudly. But I think that's only half the journey.
That's a really, really great reminder for all of us, including myself listening. And that's a good challenge as well. how did this impact you? You said you had maybe some connections to the community in Orlando. Is that right?
Well, yeah, maybe the first impact I was referring to is, when I woke up and I heard Orlando and gay nightclub, the first thing I thought of is, oh, do I know anybody? Because as you mentioned, yes, I grew up as a teenager. I grew up in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico was a place that I called home for over 30 years, even though I was moving around and living in a lot of other places. And so I know a lot of people from Puerto Rico who live part-time in Orlando or who have moved, especially given the economic issues in the island over the last couple of years and the very dire situation there. A lot of people have moved to the Orlando area. There's a very large Puerto Rican population there. So I immediately thought, oh, I wonder if I know anybody. And so then I thought, well, no, those are mostly probably people in their 20s and you're in your 40s. So maybe there isn't that much commonality. But, I immediately thought of that and actually reached out to a friend, like I said, who's from Puerto Rico. And she and I have been really good friends for a long time, who lives down here in Miami. And I asked her, I said, do you know anybody? Do we know anybody, or do we know of anybody who's been affected by this? And we didn't. But obviously felt very close to it by virtue of the fact that it's Florida, but mostly Latino Florida. And I live now in Miami, which is basically Latin America and the United States. I mean, I had a friend who came here to visit a few months ago, and she was like, "Oh my God, nobody speaks English down here."
Yeah, actually, I was there a few months ago too. And
that's right, you were.
It might have been me. You were talking with. Yeah, we had trouble taking a cab sometimes because we didn't speak Spanish. So I thought it was a delightful place, very artistic and wonderful. Anyway, that's an aside, but really enjoyed visiting.
It's a fun and happy place, and very, very Latino. But so I think that one of the first things I did, for example, was I actually went to get my parents that day, and we were going to church, and I told them about it while we were in the car, and I said, let's see if the priest brings this up in during Mass today. Thankfully, he did, because otherwise I would have gotten really angry, probably got walked out or something, as I've been known to do. And then after that, we started getting more and more information, and then that led to a conversation between me and my parents about it, and then also led to several conversations with other Puerto Rican friends who are living in Puerto Rico and also here. And some of those conversations actually, one friend said something which I thought was really insightful. He said, well, not that there is any silver lining in any of these atrocious situations, but he said, if anything, I forget how he phrased it, but he said something like the rest of the world is getting to see a different face from what they normally consider the gay white male in the United States. And they're getting to see the Puerto Rican community, gay community, or LGBT community in Orlando, and that creates greater visibility. And I think there's truth to that. But like I said before, it's just it's an opportunity to see it, but to also see that some white gay guy in Maine or straight white woman in Oregon may be wishing to extend love to that community. And like we were saying before, it's okay for the community in Orlando to say, we're going to mourn ourselves. But I also thought it was really, really beautiful to see them come together and actually accept the attention and the love that they were getting from other places. Now, having said that, it was also infuriating to see how it wasn't getting attention and love from certain places who, immediately wanted to just stick it within the narrative and the paradigm of terrorism and ISIS and that.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty strong critiques that some news outlets and pundits are refusing to recognize that it was a gay nightclub, like not even mentioning that or saying that. I don't know if they think that would make them part of the quote unquote gay agenda or something. I don't know, but it seems like what better way to disrupt the narrative that being gay is like a bored rich white boy thing, which to name a terrible stereotype that it's some kind of choice or that people or whatever people think, than to offer, like real stories of, people from around the globe who are gay and who have not chosen, but are likely very proud of who they are. And we're celebrating that night with their friends and out to have a good time. And that was taken from them. And so I think, to me, it seems like it really does disrupt a narrative that people want to tell themselves that the gay lifestyle is a quote unquote choice, right? The quote unquote gay lifestyle. I'm using a lot of air quotes with my fingers right now. But.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, I saw that too. And I forget who it was that said it. Like, oh, it wasn't a gay club. It was a Latino club. And immediately I thought, okay, here we go into the hierarchy of acceptance. So in this person's limited understanding of the universe, it's somewhat okay or better to be Latino than it is to be gay, number one. And then number two, it was, I also thought this is such a blatant attempt to rob a community of pain. And then I said, why is that? And I thought, well, because if you rob a community of the opportunity to express and own a particular pain inflicted upon them, then they will have a right to be angry about it. And then they will have a right to demand that they be treated equally. And this person is probably not comfortable with that outcome. So he goes to the root and wants to basically say, well, you don't even have a right to be angry because it wasn't really targeting you. It was targeting Latinos. I even saw some other stuff in the last couple of days about all these conspiracy theories of people that are coming up and saying that people that survived the attacks were actually actors. Have you seen this?
What?
Yes. They've all of these conspiracy theories have begun to surface saying that a woman who survived the attack was actually a Fox intern who was acting it all out and was planted in order to elicit sympathy for the LGBT community. I'm telling you, the stuff that they're coming up with is just out of control.
I can't believe that people will go to that extent to try to explain away this. I mean, it's so obviously not a conspiracy. What? Oh, I had a thought. Hold on a second. I'm so frustrated just hearing that it shoved all the other thoughts out of my mind.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm actually looking it up now. Yeah. Oh, here it is. Orlando shooting survivor harassed by online conspiracy cooks as a, quote, crisis actor in a staged event.
Oh my God, that poor person is probably completely traumatized, and that's the last thing that they need. Like, why would people be so cruel?
Her name is Patience Carter.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, it seems like, and I've been hearing a lot of conversations around the term pinkwashing, meaning now that there's a relative increasing acceptance, or there's a perception of increasing acceptance of corporations getting on the gay pride bandwagon. So like now if you go to gay pride events, you'll see corporations, advertising, and people have termed this pinkwashing, meaning corporations who are really not LGBTQ friendly or inclusive, kind of pretending to be so that they can build their brand. But I wonder if the thought that occurred to me is, if this event had happened 20 or 30 years ago, I wonder if the public response would have been different and how it would have been different. And I've talked to several people who have no idea about the history of violence against LGBTQ people, even in the last century, let alone in the US, let alone globally or throughout time. But, a lot of people don't know what Stonewall was. A lot of people don't know that history at all. And so they see this as an isolated event.
A lot of gay people don't know that. A lot of gay people, young gay people, are only now beginning to know that. A lot of, I have asked quite a few now that I spent time in Boston and had the chance to meet a lot of gay men in their 20s, if they knew what ACT UP was, and they didn't. But going back to your previous point, I think the answer is yes. I think if this had happened 30 years ago, the response would have been very different. And I do think that there is progress. And the proof point I have for that is the AIDS epidemic. Because had it not been for ACT UP, and for the first 6 to 10 years of the epidemic, when thousands of gay men were dying, it was either gay men or drug addicts. As it is now better known, the entire country ignored it. The government refused to even utter the words HIV or AIDS for a year, and were actually advised not to use it because it didn't matter that the people that were getting killed and annihilated by this virus were people that didn't give a shit about. So, yes, I think that if this had happened in the 80s or in the 90s, we would have seen a different response. And I think that the response now, however pink-washed it may be, is better than it would have been 30 years ago. And however ill-fitted the motivations, whether corporate or otherwise, I'd rather take the progress over the last 30 years than not take it. And I'd rather look forward to the progress that's to come in the next 30 than stay stagnant where I'm at now.
Yeah. It reminds me of something you said earlier about empathy, something around the, sometimes we can't know what valid empathy is or isn't. And we just have to accept the expression and sometimes maybe not question people's motives. Would you agree with that?
No, I think it's okay to question it. I did some of my own personal writing over the last few days about this. And I said on a particular day that I was feeling really angry, and I had been reading about the Florida Attorney General, Pam Bondi, and how all of a sudden with Anderson Cooper, she was trying to sound all LGBTQ friendly when we know she wasn't. And I was writing about this and I was saying, something to the extent of, you don't fool us. Even if you're more polite about it, even if you're more inclusive, even if you've had no choice but to accept the crumbling logic of your ill-fitted laws, and even if you've had no choice but to grant us equal rights in some realms, we still have further to go. You still deep down inside, and this is part of what I was writing, you deep down inside are still glad that you're not, quote unquote, one of them. And, it's the same argument that I use with people who say, oh, well, the Catholic Church will never marry same-sex couples. And I say to them, well, you know what? I don't need them to. It'd be great, but I'm not planning on getting married myself, but I don't need them to. And where I'm getting with all of this is that it is okay to question their motivation, but you get to a point where you cannot do that with everybody because, again, nothing that is human can be foreign to me. And we're all capable of deceit, and we're all capable of manipulation, and we're all capable of hypocrisy. And so at the end of the day, what matters is the people that are closest to you and the people that affect your life, such as your employers, and the people that, enact and pass laws that we need to make sure are fair and that continue to grant us the space that we deserve as equal citizens in the country. And whether the person signing that law does it gleefully or resentfully, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much, as long as the law is passed.
That's very interesting coming from you in particular, because you're an attorney. I mean, that's interesting to hear your take. Like you can see the long game of that action, and I think a lot of us get stuck in well, this person's doing this begrudgingly. We don't want them on our team. We don't want them fighting for us because, or whatever,
Well, if we do that, we would have an ever dwindling, perhaps not, but no, I should take that back. I was going to say a dwindling number of allies, and that's not necessarily true. I think genuine allies do come forth and are built and evolve. But for strategic purposes, I think it's always important to get all the help that we can get. And then for personal and moral and emotional purposes, it does make a difference that people mean what they say. And I think that's where I would draw the line,
Yeah, that's helpful. But politically, people have to make all kinds of alliances to get things done. And I think it's easy to forget that this stuff, society gets more humane and safer for everyone when activists take up that work. I mean, I think a lot of us feel disempowered on a regular basis, and it just seems like issues go into some big machine and then they come out prepackaged as legislation or policy on the other side, and then culture gets affected. But that's not all how it works. It's actually real people doing that, and real people changing their minds, and real people having conversations and getting, rubbing shoulders with each other and grappling socially, culturally together on how could we be doing this better. And so all of us are needed in that work, even from a molecular level up to a state level. Rafael, thank you. It has been such a pleasure to talk with you today. And I learned so much every time I talk to you. So I'm tremendously grateful that you gave your time to us, and we hope to have you back sometime, maybe.
I would love that. And you're incredibly, incredibly gracious. You always have been. And thank you for inviting me and just having an opportunity to discuss these things with you. I'm in awe of you and what you do and what you'll continue to do. So I'm glad that I'm staying close to it.
I'm feeling the love.
Good.
You're awesome.
Good.
All right. You have a great day. And everyone listening, also have a great day. And we'll see you back here next week.